A freezing winter morning at a remote military outpost, a wounded dog appeared at their gate. Soldiers rushed to the gate after an alert, expecting danger. Instead, an injured dog limps toward them, its eyes pleading for help. The dog's behavior was unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. Instead of running away in fear or showing any aggression, the animal slowly limped toward them. Its fur was soaked from the frost, and its paws were bleeding from what seemed like a long, painful journey. The dog let out soft whimpers, the kind that didn't just make noise but carried a plea, as if it was begging for help. The soldiers, trained to deal with threats and danger, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. This wasn't something they were prepared for. The dog wasn't attacking, wasn't running, it was simply standing there, looking at them with desperate, intelligent eyes. It almost seemed like the dog knew these humans could help, and it was willing to risk everything to reach them. One soldier instinctively raised his weapon, unsure if the dog might suddenly become hostile. But the commanding officer, standing behind him, quickly ordered, "Hold your fire." The officer couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't just wandering aimlessly, it had come with a purpose. He stepped forward cautiously, motioning for the others to lower their weapons. The dog remained still, watching their every move. There was no fear in its eyes, no aggression, just a silent urgency that pulled at the officer's heart. He crouched slightly, hoping to appear less threatening, and watched as the dog lifted its head and whimpered again. The sound echoed through the cold morning air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. As the soldiers stood on edge, the dog took a few shaky steps back, turning toward the forest. Then it stopped, looking back at them, as if waiting for them to follow. It repeated the motion, stepping toward the forest and then pausing, its eyes never leaving the humans. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. "What's it doing?" one of them whispered. "I think it's trying to lead us somewhere," another replied. The commanding officer stood silently, observing the dog. Its movements weren't random, they were deliberate, purposeful. Whatever this dog wanted to show them, it had gone through unimaginable hardships to make it here and ask for their help. The officer knew they couldn't just ignore this. "This isn't normal," he finally said. "Something's going on here. It's not just a stray, it needs us for something." The dog, as if sensing the officer's decision, turned back toward the forest and took a few more steps, its limp obvious and painful to watch. Then it stopped again, waiting. The soldiers could feel the urgency in the air, as if time was running out for whatever had brought this dog to their gates. The officer took a deep breath and made his decision. "Gear up," he said to his team. "We're going to see what this dog wants us to find." With that, they followed the injured animal into the unknown, not knowing what they might discover but unable to ignore its desperate plea. The dog stood trembling in the cold, its body visibly frostbitten, with patches of ice clinging to its fur. Its paws were red with blood, proof of the grueling journey it must have endured to reach the military outpost. Every breath it took came out as a puff of white mist in the freezing air, but even in this state of exhaustion, the dog didn't seem to want to rest. It kept glancing toward the nearby forest, then back at the soldiers, as if it was trying to say something. The soldiers, watching the dog carefully, felt a strange unease. This wasn't normal behavior for a stray or a wild animal. Usually, animals avoided humans, especially those armed and in uniform. But this dog wasn't afraid. Instead, it seemed determined, almost as if it understood that these humans were its last hope. Its eyes were filled with urgency, and its actions were too deliberate to be dismissed as random. One soldier broke the silence, whispering, "It's hurt bad. How did it even make it this far?" The commanding officer, standing at the front of the group, observed the dog closely. He noticed the way it limped, dragging one paw slightly, yet still forcing itself to move. The dog wasn't here to beg for food or warmth. Its body language was clear, it wanted them to follow. The dog took a few shaky steps toward the edge of the forest, then stopped, turning its head back to look at the soldiers. Its ears perked slightly, as if waiting for them to act. When no one moved, it whimpered softly, the sound cutting through the frozen air like a plea for help. Then it walked a little further, stopped again, and looked back once more. The pattern repeated itself, the dog clearly trying to guide them somewhere. "It's leading us," one of the soldiers muttered, his voice filled with uncertainty. The officer nodded slowly. "It's not random," he said. "This dog is trying to tell us something." The dog's determination was undeniable. Despite its visible pain, it refused to give up. Every step it took was slow and labored, but it kept moving, occasionally pausing to check if the humans were following. Its intelligence was startling, there was no other way to explain its actions. "What could it want us to see?" another soldier asked, confused. "Whatever it is, it's important enough for it to come all this way," the officer replied. He couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring the dog's plea would be a mistake. He had seen animals act out of desperation before, but this was different. This dog wasn't acting out of instinct, it was acting with purpose. The officer crouched down slightly, trying to meet the dog's gaze. For a moment, their eyes locked. The dog's gaze was filled with something almost human, fear, urgency, and trust all at once. It wasn't just asking for help, it was depending on them to listen and act. The officer felt a deep pang of responsibility. "This dog came here for a reason," he said firmly. "And I don't think we can ignore it." The dog let out another soft whimper, took a few more steps toward the forest, and stopped again. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. They had been trained to follow protocol, to prepare for threats, but none of that training had prepared them for this, a frostbitten dog pleading for help in the middle of the wilderness. "Commander, are we really going to follow it?" one soldier asked hesitantly. The officer didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Get the gear. We're going to see where this dog takes us." As the soldiers began to prepare, the dog stood patiently, still glancing between them and the forest. Its quiet determination inspired a mix of awe and urgency among the team. Despite everything it had been through, the dog wasn't giving up. It was clear to the officer now, this wasn't just a random animal. This dog had come to them with a purpose, and they were about to find out what it was. The soldiers stood in silence, watching the dog as it whimpered and limped toward the forest, glancing back at them every few steps. Its body was battered and exhausted, yet its determination was unshaken. It was clear that the dog wanted their help, but following it meant breaking protocol, a decision that could have serious consequences. The commander, standing at the front of the group, felt the weight of the situation. His years of military training told him to follow the rules, stay inside the base, and prioritize the safety of his team. But looking at the dog, with its frostbitten body and pleading eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an animal looking for food or shelter. The dog had come all this way for a reason, and ignoring it felt wrong. "We can't just leave it," one soldier said hesitantly. "It's not here by accident." Another soldier chimed in, "What if it's a trap? What if it leads us into danger?" The commander remained quiet, thinking carefully. The military's strict protocol prohibited leaving the base for anything that wasn't an immediate threat or mission. Wandering into the wilderness, especially in these freezing conditions, could put the entire team at risk. But the dog's desperation was undeniable. It had traveled so far, through snow and ice, risking its own life to reach them. There had to be something urgent it wanted them to see. After a few moments, the commander finally spoke. "We can't ignore this," he said firmly. "That dog is trying to tell us something, and I'm not going to stand here and do nothing." The soldiers exchanged nervous glances. They trusted their commander, but the idea of leaving the safety of the base to follow an injured dog into the unknown was unsettling. Still, they could see the determination in his eyes, and they knew he wouldn't change his mind. The commander quickly began organizing a small team. "We'll take only what we need," he said. "4 of us will go, myself and 3 others. The rest of you will stay here and keep the base secure." He chose 3 of his most experienced soldiers for the mission, knowing they would be able to handle the unpredictable challenges they might face. They packed lightly but carefully, taking medical supplies, emergency rations, flashlights, and survival gear. The commander also insisted on bringing a thermal blanket, just in case the dog needed immediate care. "Make sure we're prepared for anything," he told the team. "We don't know what's out there or how far we'll have to go." As they prepared to leave, the dog sat quietly at the edge of the forest, waiting patiently. It seemed to understand that they were getting ready to follow, and its soft whimpers turned to quiet huffs, as if it was encouraging them to hurry. Before stepping out, the commander turned to the rest of his men. "Stay alert and keep in contact. If we're not back in 6 hours, call for backup." The team gave a final nod, and then they stepped into the biting cold. The dog immediately began leading them, its pace slow but steady. The soldiers followed closely, their boots crunching through the snow as the wind howled around them. The forest ahead looked dark and unforgiving, the towering trees covered in ice, their branches swaying in the harsh wind. None of them knew what they were walking into, but the commander couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing the right thing. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, he glanced at the dog, limping but determined. It had risked everything to reach them, and now it was their turn to repay that trust. The decision had been difficult, but as they followed the dog into the unknown, the commander hoped that whatever they found would make it all worth it. The cold was relentless as the team followed the dog into the vast wilderness. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and icy winds bit at their faces, but they pushed forward, their eyes fixed on the determined dog ahead of them. Despite its injuries, the dog moved with purpose, its limping gait a painful reminder of how far it had already traveled. Every so often, it would pause, turning back to look at the soldiers, as if checking to make sure they were still following. When it saw them close behind, it would continue, its focus unwavering. The terrain grew more difficult with each step. The team had to navigate through thick snowdrifts and uneven ground, their heavy gear weighing them down. Low-hanging branches, coated with frost, scratched at their jackets as they pushed through dense forest. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the bitter chill of the freezing wilderness. The commander, leading the team, kept a close eye on the dog, marveling at its resilience. It was clear that the animal was exhausted and in pain, but its determination never wavered. "This dog is something else," one soldier muttered, his breath forming a white cloud in the cold air. "Yeah," another replied. "I've never seen anything like it. It's like it knows exactly where it's going." The dog led them through the forest, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or glance back at the humans. Its movements weren't random, they were deliberate, as if it had a destination in mind. Even when the path became more treacherous, the dog never hesitated. At one point, the team reached a frozen stream. The thin layer of ice covering the water was cracked in places, making it dangerous to cross. The dog stopped at the edge, carefully testing the ice with one paw before stepping onto it. "Be careful," the commander warned his team. "If the dog can cross, so can we, but go slow." The soldiers followed the dog's path across the stream, stepping cautiously to avoid breaking through the ice. Every step was tense, the sound of cracking ice echoing in their ears. When they finally made it across, they saw the dog waiting patiently on the other side, its breath visible in the freezing air. It gave a soft whimper, as if urging them to keep moving, and then continued its journey. The deeper they went into the forest, the more challenging the terrain became. The snow grew thicker, and the ground became uneven, with hidden rocks and roots beneath the white blanket. The soldiers moved carefully, their muscles aching from the cold and the effort. Yet, despite the hardships, none of them wanted to stop. The dog's unwavering determination inspired them, pushing them to keep going even when the conditions became unbearable. "What could possibly be so important that this dog is willing to go through all this?" one soldier asked, his voice tinged with both awe and exhaustion. The commander didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it is, it's serious. No animal would go through this much pain unless it had to. As the hours passed, the dog showed no signs of giving up. Even with its frostbitten paws and visible exhaustion, it moved forward, limping but determined. Every time it stopped to check on the team, its eyes seemed to say, "We're almost there. Don't stop now." Finally, the forest began to thin out, and the terrain started to change. The dog's pace quickened slightly, as if sensing that they were close to their destination. The team, now equally determined, pushed through the last stretch of the snowy path, their breath coming in heavy puffs as the cold air stung their lungs. They didn't know what awaited them ahead, but they knew it had to be something important, something worth every step of this grueling journey. As they followed the dog into the clearing ahead, the commander felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Whatever had driven this animal to lead them so far into the wilderness was about to be revealed. The team had been walking for hours, their bodies aching from the freezing cold and the rough terrain. The dog they were following never slowed down, despite its limp and visible exhaustion. It had led them through dense forests, across icy streams, and up snowy inclines. Now, as they approached a clearing, the dog suddenly stopped. It stood still for a moment, staring ahead, its ears perked up and its body tense. The soldiers slowed down, sensing that they were finally at the end of this journey. The commander motioned for the team to proceed carefully. As they entered the clearing, the scene before them left them speechless. Underneath a large fallen tree lay another dog, trapped and barely alive. The second dog's body was almost completely buried in the snow, and its breathing was shallow. Its weak whimpers barely reached their ears, but they were heartbreaking. The first dog moved closer to its trapped companion. Despite its own injuries, it gently nudged the other dog with its nose, as if trying to wake it up. It let out soft, mournful whines, looking back at the soldiers with pleading eyes. The message was clear: it had brought them here to save its friend. The commander and his team exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't just any animal behavior, they were witnessing something extraordinary. The loyalty and desperation of the first dog were unlike anything they had ever seen. "Sir, we need to help it now," one soldier said, breaking the silence. The commander nodded. "Let's move." The soldiers quickly assessed the situation. The fallen tree was massive, its weight pinning the injured dog to the frozen ground. Snow and ice had built up around the tree, making it even more difficult to move. The team knew they had to act fast, time was running out for the trapped dog. "Get the ropes and tools," the commander ordered. "We'll lift the tree just enough to pull it out." As the soldiers worked, the first dog stayed close to its companion. It continued to nudge the trapped dog, occasionally licking its face, as if trying to comfort it. The scene was both heartbreaking and inspiring. This dog had risked everything to find help for its friend, and now it was staying by its side until the end. The soldiers worked as quickly as they could, using ropes to secure the tree and digging away the snow and ice. The freezing air bit at their faces and hands, but they didn't stop. The commander kept an eye on the first dog, who was watching their every move. It seemed to understand what they were doing and stayed out of the way, its eyes never leaving its injured friend. After what felt like an eternity, the team finally managed to lift the tree slightly off the ground. The commander and another soldier carefully pulled the injured dog out from underneath. Its body was limp, and its fur was matted with snow and dirt. The dog let out a weak whimper, its eyes barely open. It was alive, but just barely. "Get the thermal blanket," the commander said quickly. They wrapped the injured dog in a warm blanket and checked for injuries. Its breathing was shallow, and its paws were scraped and bleeding, but there were no broken bones. Still, its condition was critical. The first dog moved closer, sniffing its friend and letting out a soft, relieved whimper. It lay down beside the injured dog, pressing its body against it as if to share its warmth. The soldiers watched in silence, their hearts heavy. The commander took a deep breath, breaking the moment. "We need to get them both back to the base. They won't survive out here." The team prepared to carry the injured dog, while the first dog stayed close, walking alongside them despite its own exhaustion. As they made their way back through the snowy wilderness, the soldiers couldn't stop thinking about what they had just witnessed, a powerful display of loyalty, courage, and love that they would never forget. The soldiers wasted no time as they began the rescue mission. The fallen tree was heavy and covered in layers of snow and ice, making the task even more challenging. Despite the freezing wind biting at their faces and the exhaustion from hours of trekking, they knew there was no room for error. Time was running out for the injured dog. The commander quickly assigned roles. 2 soldiers started cutting away the smaller branches and snow-packed debris around the tree, while another prepared ropes to help lift it. The rest of the team secured the area, ensuring they had a safe and stable position to work from. Every movement had to be calculated. One wrong step could make the situation worse. The first dog stood close to the trapped one, refusing to leave. Its eyes stayed fixed on its injured companion, and it whimpered softly, as though trying to comfort it. Even as the soldiers worked around it, the dog remained still, its loyalty unwavering. It was clear that no matter what happened, it wouldn't abandon its friend. "It's like it understands everything we're doing," one soldier whispered, his voice filled with amazement. "It's not just a dog," another replied. "It's something special." As the soldiers worked, they could feel the emotional weight of the moment. They had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, but this was different. Watching the bond between the 2 dogs, the way the first one stayed by its friend's side, refusing to give up, was unlike anything they had ever seen. After clearing the debris, the team focused on the main task, lifting the tree. The commander and 2 soldiers wrapped ropes around the base of the trunk while another tied a pulley system to give them better leverage. They all knew this was the most dangerous part of the rescue. The tree was old and unstable, and any sudden movement could cause it to shift unexpectedly. "On my count," the commander said firmly. 3, 2, 1, pull." The soldiers pulled with all their strength, their boots digging into the snow as they strained against the weight of the tree. Slowly, it began to lift. The injured dog let out a weak whimper as the pressure on its body eased. The first dog moved closer, nudging its companion gently, as if encouraging it to hold on. "Just a little more," the commander called out. The soldiers gave one final push, lifting the tree just enough to free the trapped dog. 2 soldiers carefully slid the injured dog out from under the trunk, wrapping it immediately in a thermal blanket to keep it warm. Its body was limp and weak, its breathing shallow, but it was alive. The first dog immediately moved to its friend's side, sniffing it and licking its face. It let out soft whines, clearly relieved that its companion was no longer trapped. The soldiers, toughened by years of military training, couldn't hide their emotions. Some wiped tears from their eyes as they watched the touching display of loyalty and love. "We need to treat it right away," the commander said, snapping the team back to focus. One soldier checked the injured dog for broken bones while another prepared a medical kit. The dog had deep scratches on its paws and legs, and its body was cold to the touch. They cleaned its wounds, applied antiseptic, and wrapped its injuries in bandages. Every step was done with care, knowing how fragile the dog's condition was. The first dog stayed close throughout the process, lying beside its companion and pressing its body against it, as if trying to share its warmth. Its unwavering dedication moved the soldiers deeply. Once the injured dog was stabilized, the commander gave the next order. "We're getting them both back to the base. They won't survive out here." The team fashioned a makeshift stretcher using their gear to carry the injured dog. The first dog followed closely, limping alongside the soldiers, refusing to leave its friend's side. As they began the long trek back to the base, the soldiers couldn't help but reflect on what they had just witnessed. The loyalty and courage of the first dog had inspired them in a way they would never forget. It wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a reminder of the incredible bond between animals and humans, and the power of love and loyalty to overcome even the toughest challenges. The journey back to the base was long and cold, but the soldiers moved with purpose. One of them carried the injured dog on a makeshift stretcher, while the first dog limped alongside, refusing to let its friend out of sight. Despite its exhaustion and injuries, the first dog stayed close, occasionally looking up at the stretcher to check on its companion. Its loyalty touched every soldier deeply, filling the silence with a sense of awe and respect. The commander led the group, his thoughts heavy. He had seen many things during his military career: bravery, sacrifice, and survival in the harshest conditions, but this was different. The bond between the two dogs, especially the courage of the first dog, was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. It wasn't just loyalty, it was love in its purest form. The soldiers moved as quickly as they could, knowing the injured dog needed immediate care. They were tired, their bodies aching from the freezing cold and hours of effort, but none of them complained. Watching the first dog's determination gave them strength. If this dog could push through its pain to save its friend, they knew they could do the same. When the team finally reached the base, the soldiers inside rushed to help. The injured dog was taken to a warm, sheltered area where the team quickly began treating it. Blankets were wrapped around its frail body, and warm water was brought to help it regain strength. The soldiers cleaned its wounds, applied bandages, and checked for broken bones. Slowly, the dog began to breathe more steadily, though it was still weak. The first dog stayed right by its companion's side, lying close to it and refusing to move. When the injured dog whimpered, the first dog gently nuzzled it, as if saying, "You're safe now." The soldiers watched this interaction in silence, their tough exteriors melting as they witnessed the bond between the two animals. One soldier, a man who had been in the military for years, shook his head and said quietly, "I've seen humans leave their own behind in worse situations. But this dog? It risked everything for its friend." Another soldier added, "It didn't just find us, it led us all the way back here. It knew we could help, and it never gave up. I don't think I've ever seen that kind of devotion." The commander stood nearby, his arms crossed as he observed the scene. He had made the difficult decision to follow the dog into the wilderness, breaking protocol and risking the safety of his team. But now, watching the two dogs together, he knew it had been the right choice. The first dog's courage and determination had not only saved its friend's life but had also reminded everyone of the power of loyalty and love. Over the next few hours, the injured dog began to show signs of improvement. It moved its head slightly, its eyes opening to look at the first dog, who stayed close. The soldiers couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was clear that the injured dog drew comfort from its companion's presence. Later that evening, as the soldiers gathered to reflect on the day, the conversation turned to what they had witnessed. One soldier said, "We train to stay strong, to protect each other no matter what. But I don't think any of us could match what that dog did today." Another nodded. It didn't care about the danger or the pain. All it cared about was saving its friend. That's real bravery. The story of the two dogs spread quickly among the soldiers at the base. For days, the first dog stayed by its companion's side as it recovered, never leaving it alone for a moment. The soldiers, inspired by the dog's bond, treated them with the utmost care and respect. In the end, the experience left a lasting impact on everyone involved. It wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a lesson in courage, loyalty, and love that none of them would ever forget. After several days of care, both dogs began to recover. The injured dog, once so weak it could barely lift its head, was now walking slowly around the base. Its wounds had been cleaned and treated, and the warmth and nourishment had brought life back into its body. The first dog, always close by, seemed to relax for the first time, knowing its friend was safe. The soldiers watched the two animals with a sense of pride and admiration, knowing they had played a part in saving them. The bond between the two dogs was unbreakable. Wherever one went, the other followed. Even during treatment, the first dog stayed close, lying next to its companion, keeping it calm and reassured. The soldiers couldn't help but feel inspired by their connection. It was a reminder of the kind of loyalty and love that is rare, even among humans. But the time had come to let the dogs return to the wild. The base was not a place for animals to live, and the commander knew the dogs would be happier and freer in their natural environment. The decision wasn't easy. Over the past few days, the dogs had become part of the team, and the soldiers had grown attached to them. Still, they knew it was the right thing to do. Early one morning, the soldiers prepared for the release. They opened the gates and walked the dogs to the edge of the forest, where they could return to the wilderness. The injured dog, now much stronger, stood confidently beside its loyal friend. The soldiers knelt down to say their quiet goodbyes, gently patting the dogs and whispering words of encouragement. "You're strong now," one soldier said softly. "Take care of each other." The first dog looked up at the soldiers, its intelligent eyes filled with something they could only describe as gratitude. It seemed to understand what was happening and knew that these humans had done everything they could to help. For a moment, it hesitated, standing still as if it didn't want to leave. Then, with a gentle nudge, the first dog encouraged its companion to move. The two dogs stepped toward the forest, pausing at the tree line. The first dog turned back one last time, its eyes locking with the commander's. In that brief moment, it seemed to say everything it couldn't with words: "Thank you, goodbye, and we won't forget." The soldiers stood silently, watching as the dogs disappeared into the dense forest. The sound of their footsteps faded, and soon, they were gone. The clearing felt quiet and empty, but the soldiers' hearts were full. They had witnessed something extraordinary, an act of courage, loyalty, and love that had left a mark on all of them. One soldier broke the silence, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'll never forget those two. That dog, it's braver than most people I know." The commander nodded, his gaze still fixed on the forest. "They reminded us of what really matters. Loyalty, trust, and doing what's right, even when it's hard." As the soldiers walked back to the base, they couldn't help but feel changed by the experience. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary, a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The image of the first dog looking back, its eyes filled with gratitude, stayed with them. It was a moment they would never forget. Back at the base, things slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the two dogs lingered. Occasionally, the soldiers would look out into the forest, wondering how the dogs were doing. Though they knew they might never see them again, they found comfort in knowing they had made a difference. The story of the dogs became a legend at the base, a reminder of the power of courage, love, and selflessness. And though the dogs had returned to the wild, their legacy lived on in the hearts of the soldiers who had been fortunate enough to witness it. The story of the two dogs left a deep impact on everyone at the base. The soldiers, who had spent years facing dangers and challenges, were humbled by what they had witnessed. The courage of the first dog and its unwavering love for its companion had shown them something they didn't expect: how acts of loyalty and selflessness could transcend species. The experience made the soldiers reflect on their own lives. They realized how much they could learn from the dog's bond. It wasn't about survival or instinct, it was about trust, courage, and doing what was right, no matter the risks. The first dog had put everything on the line to save its friend, and that kind of devotion was something they would never forget. For days after the dogs returned to the wild, the base felt different. The soldiers found themselves looking out toward the forest, wondering how the two were doing. Though they knew the dogs had returned to their natural home, they couldn't help but feel connected to them. The memory of the first dog's determined eyes and the quiet gratitude it showed would stay with them forever. The commander often thought about the decision to follow the dog that day. Breaking protocol hadn't been easy, but it was the right thing to do. The experience reminded him, and his team, that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. The dogs had shown them that love, courage, and loyalty know no boundaries, and those lessons would remain in their hearts for a lifetime.